Okay, the first thing that we did in class today is we talked about the qualities of a good student. Now, what are they? And you might say something like hardworking, intelligent, um, on task, arrives to class on time. A lot of other things might fit into that category. But then the next point that I wanted to make is now compare them to those of a leader. What do you think? Do you find them to be the same? Are there similarities? The suggestion that I would make is yes, because a good leader is somebody who works hard, who is on time, who participates in discussions, who listens to what's going on because they need to be aware of other people. They're a good example and a good role model. And I think that the connection is easily found because in reality, if you want to be a good student, you have to be a good leader of yourself in your learning. Whereas if you want to be a good leader, it's really a leader of others potentially, but the same qualities should manifest themselves in both people. What we're really looking at today, though, is one of the greatest leaders in American history, that being George Washington. And today's lesson is titled Normal Man or Dumb Man. So we're going to be looking at George Washington from that aspect. Our target today, I can explain why I think that George Washington was either a normal man or dumb man. In other words, really, really important, significant individual in history. So we have a target. First one in a while here. There's the normal man hitting the target with the arrow. And going to the scorer's table. Native American, 7. James Harrison, -3. Paul Abdul. Okay. And 11. It's out of 10, but she doesn't care. And then there's Abraham Lincoln. Dumb man. Put a blindfold on him. You thought he missed, but don't worry. He wouldn't miss. Launches the rock that looks like tinfoil into outer space. Hitting the UFO carrying Chuck Norris, which then leads him back into our atmosphere, where he can then be crushed into the target by Super Wilson. And then Super Wilson kicks a random basketball, and it goes into a hoop that, well, I have no idea where it's located. And his score is greater. Now, on to class here. Recapping history. The Revolutionary War ends, and it's been a while since we talked about history, but it ended. America gains its freedom. It tries an initial government, which is dictated by the Articles of Confederation, that fails. They meet, and this is delegates from multiple states, meet at what is known as the Constitutional Convention. Their goal is to fix the Articles of Confederation. However, they ended up creating a whole new government because, well, the original government with the Articles was just way too weak. In this new government, there is to be a president. Now, that's something that's really controversial to a lot of people because they're concerned about, what powers are they going to have? I mean, a whole branch of the government is saying that we shouldn't have, or not branch of the government, but a whole group of the Founding Fathers is saying that we shouldn't have this because it's going to lead to tyranny and all kinds of problems because the president will end up like a king. Those people were known as the Anti-Federalists, by the way. But who should be the new president? Because it's a very important duty. Well, one candidate is unanimously selected. The ultra-important person is not Oprah Winfrey, Ben Roethlisberger, or Will Ferrell. It is George Washington. George Washington. We've talked about him really a lot in his military roles as a commander in the French Indian War, where he actually was involved in starting the war. Then we talked about him as the leader of the Continental Army in the Revolution. But he actually has a lot more to him than just that. Let's talk about him first from his individual personal life. He married a woman named Martha Dandridge Custis. She was a wealthy widow who had 2 kids. There's a painting of her. He lived as an aristocrat. In other words, he was wealthy, upper-class society. He got access to a lot of the nicer things in life. And at this point in time, there still is really more of a divide between the upper class and the lower class than there is today. I mean, today we have much more of a middle class than there would have been during their time. So there's Washington. He was also a slave owner, which is something interesting about him. And the reason that I pointed out is because I don't want you to think that every single person who's a slave owner in history is this evil person. While I do disagree with slavery and wholeheartedly, you have to understand this is really much more a part of their culture. And a lot of these people grew up with that as being normal, and that's what they viewed as being normal. Washington did, however, state in his lifetime that slavery was a problem that should end, and he knew that it was going to end up being an issue later on. Professional life. He was a military leader in the French and Indian War and the Revolutionary War, as we have talked about. He also was a politician in the House of Burgesses in Virginia. This was a colonial government that existed in America prior to separating from Britain. It had a lot of authority over the colonies. Obviously, King George still had the most authority, and what he said went, but the House of Burgesses was kind of like a leadership group amongst the colonists. So the point that I'm trying to make here is that I don't want you to think that George Washington takes office as president without having ever served as a politician before. It's like he just wins the Revolutionary War and then steps in and assumes the presidency without having any experience at all in this type of life. He did have experience in it prior to his role as president. We've talked before that he's very, very well respected, and he is. He's one of the most respected people in American history. It's amazing. I think that's really, you can see it very clearly with the fact that he was unanimously elected president in 1789. And if you look at the ticket, I mean, it's unbelievable. This is something that never happened. So here's how it works. In the election of vice president, it switches throughout history from being a direct election, which the vice president gets a second vote or secondary vote, or just being the person who gets the next most votes. But here's basically how it ran with the suggestion of who would become president. Washington gets elected on every single ballot, with all the votes, essentially. It was just a matter of who's going to be his vice president, and that ended up being John Adams getting the most votes, whereas some of these other famous people, including John Jay and John Hancock, two of the more famous out of this group, they did not win this exact election with that role. The one thing I want you to understand is that when you look at elections today, I mean, it's unbelievable to think about, there's always a second candidate getting votes. I mean, President Obama won pretty convincingly in 2008 over John McCain, and you can see all this red here. These are all the states that were won by John McCain. It still looks relatively even though electorally speaking, President Obama won very convincingly. And that's one point that I really want you to understand is the fact that it's not common at all to have a president win that many votes, especially given that George Washington didn't even have a political party. That makes it even crazier. Now, first is the best. George Washington, let's put it this way. He served 8 years as president, and he set the stage for a lot of future presidents because his actions were going to be followed by others. Because while there is writing and there's wording on how the president's supposed to be, there's no action, and there's no real leader, and there's no model to follow. I mean, for all of us, we have a model to follow. As a teacher, I had my student teaching, and I would go in and observe classes, and even as a student, I had teachers that I could look to. George Washington had nobody in the same situation because the president was kind of unique. It's not like he's going to follow King George's role, so what is he going to do here? And that's going to be an important thing for us to see. So what we're going to look at today are the precedents that he set on future presidents. Let's put it this way. A precedent is a decision made by one person that serves as a guide for how other people in their position should handle similar situations in the future. In other words, if the president is supposed to, or is invited to go to something, the way that George Washington decided to do that would end up being followed later on by people because they said, well, Washington didn't do this. That's really not traditionally what people in our role are supposed to do. We'll look at some of these in particular. First off, the role of the president. Washington very clearly established the fact that the president cannot be a king. He did this in a couple of different ways. First off, he made it so that the title that he went by was Mr. President, not Your Highness. That's a big deal, and some of us are like, oh, it's just a title. But the title does play a pretty significant role because if you start calling somebody Your Highness, eventually, well, it might kind of come off as if you are a king. He also established the fact that term limits should be 2 terms maximum. In other words, a president should not be elected more than twice to a 4-year term in office, which means that the longest a president should serve is 8 years. It was an unwritten rule that was essentially followed and not broken until almost 150 years later by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, whenever he was president at the end of the Depression and into World War II, when he got elected to 4 consecutive terms. He died in office during his 4th term, so he ended up serving right around 13 years in office. Now, the other thing that he did to try to make it more presidential versus being king-like was he made it so that his cabinet was not just his friends. He basically said, look, the cabinet should be the best and brightest minds in the nation. And to recap what the cabinet is, this is the group of special advisors that kind of helps the president to do the best job that he can in office so that he knows, what's best for the nation. The cabinet should not just be the friends of the president. It should be the best and brightest minds in the nation. Washington establishes that early on with the point being, even if I disagree with somebody, I still need to make sure that I have the best people in that place because while I might not like it, if it's what's best for the people, that's what counts the most. The one thing I do want you to understand is it's not that every single president that followed him has followed this because some of the people who end up serving in cabinets later on aren't necessarily the best, and some of them are actually friends, and we'll talk about that later on with one particular president. I want you to understand that when we say that, President Obama today, his cabinet isn't the same as it was for George Bush, and the same going forward from there. George Bush didn't fall the same as Bill Clinton either. I mean, these presidents, they do tend to have their own cabinets that favor maybe a little bit more of their political leanings than before. But as I mentioned to you, George Washington did not even have a political party, so for him that was pretty insignificant. Issue number 2, rebuilding the economy. Washington established the first national bank. It was done by Congress, but George Washington really did support it. The bank was really created with the goal being to be able to loan money to farmers and other businesses that would encourage economic growth. And economic growth was the priority of Washington's term in office. The reason being, very simply, the fact that he knew that the economy was going to be the key to America's success going forward, because with a strong economy, you can do well. With a weak one, not so much. People might say, oh, but it's really about the military. Well, the military is really supported by an economy. So if you don't have a strong economy, you're not going to be able to provide all the things you need for this. And the other aspect of this, too, is to understand that America is in the position of being a potentially growing nation. Early on, America was just on the East Coast, and even though we owned all this land going west all the way to the Mississippi River, that land really couldn't be utilized well because, well, we need to get people out there. Financially speaking, if the government could provide these people with loans, that money could be paid back later on by increased business and everything else. So by doing this right now, this sets the stage for America to really be able to expand and grow and become the country that it really did, because remember, we weren't from sea to shining sea, as they say early on. That took quite a while, and it took a lot of expansion, and really, it's all about the economy. Third, neutrality. America early on was really given the opportunity to get involved in European affairs quite a bit. George Washington, though, made it very clear that that was not what America was going to do. It says, and this is a quote from Washington, "It is the sincere wish of united America to have nothing to do with the squabbles of European nations." Now you can see by the 3 dots right here that I'm taking out a little bit of the quote, but that's the essence of what the quote is right there. The point is this. In America, our priority needs to be getting stronger, not focusing on European issues. Whether it comes to the French Revolution or Jay's Treaty, which was resolving some issues with trade, we don't need to be getting into wars overseas. We are not an ultra-powerful country at this point in time in history. So for us, doing that is only going to weaken us. Our focus needs to be on getting stronger. We don't want enemies. We just want to be left alone for the time being. Maybe in the future this will change. And the reality is the time that this really changes is World War I. So we're going all the way to the 19-teens before we get involved heavily in European affairs such as this. And, well, it really, even at that point in time, was tough, even though there was a lot of signs pointing to the fact that we need to get involved in that war. Because this idea of neutrality was something that was really favored by people in America, because they recognize, we need to separate ourselves a little bit. We need to take care of our own concerns first. Today, a lot different really than the time of Washington, because America's military is involved heavily in all kinds of different continents, let alone all the countries within those continents. So this is something that has changed over time. But early on, as I mentioned, it really lasts for 120, 130 years. Now, to do a little bit of a review here before we go on into your homework, here's what I want you to do. I want you to look at the following items and answer them on a 1 to 10 scale. First being the significance of George Washington only served 2 terms in office, 1 being insignificant, 10 being very. The significance of establishing the economy as a top priority, again, another 1 to 10, and you can push pause throughout this as you want to answer this and think about it. The significance of avoiding conflicts in the rest of the world, and really the idea of neutrality. And lastly, what do you say? Was George Washington just a man, or was he dumb man? It's something to think about, and I know it sounds silly to say dumb man, but was he an exceptional president? Or was he just there at the right time and, yeah, everything seemed to work out right? Was it chance, or was it really his choices that made it so successful? So there's our lesson today. There's also a Abundant Schools quiz that you need to make sure that you complete as well. But, yeah, George Washington, man or dumb man?